before refrigerators, before freezers, and long before vacuum-sealed packaging. How did people in medieval castles keep their food fresh? In a time when winter could starve you and siege could trap you, castle kitchens weren't just for roasting meat. They were centers of science, strategy, and survival. Today, we're stepping behind the stone walls of history to uncover the fascinating world of food preservation in medieval Europe, where salt was worth its weight in silver, smoke was a secret weapon, and every barrel, cellar, and pond helped keep entire households alive. So grab a blanket, get comfortable, and prepare to travel back in time. This is the story of how castle kitchens kept food fresh and how those ancient methods helped shape the very course of survival. As dawn breaks over the sprawling stone fortress, the kitchen wing of the castle stirs into life. The morning fog outside clings to the walls, but inside, the warm glow of the hearth casts long shadows. It is early, and the scullions, the lowest-ranking servants, are already busy. They stoke the fire, ensuring the flames rise high under the massive cauldrons hanging from iron hooks. The sound of crackling wood fills the room, chasing away the cold as the kitchen prepares for the day's work. The hearth, the beating heart of the kitchen, will remain active all day, heating the rooms, boiling stews, and roasting meats. The head cook surveys the scene with a practiced eye. His duties go far beyond preparing the evening feast. He oversees the preservation of food, an art crucial to the survival of the castle and its inhabitants. In the medieval period, the kitchen was not only a place for daily meals, but also a storage facility. There were no refrigerators or modern conveniences, so preserving food for the coming seasons required meticulous planning and execution. One of the first duties of the day is the inspection of stored provisions. The larder, a cool, stone-walled room with thick wooden shelves, is the most vital space in the kitchen. It is here that perishable items, primarily meats, dairy products, and some fruits and vegetables, are stored. The larder must maintain a constant cool temperature, and its location within the castle is carefully chosen to keep it out of the sun's reach. It is typically built against a north-facing wall, allowing the chill from the outside to keep its contents fresh. Inside the larder, sides of beef and mutton hang from hooks, carefully salted to ward off decay. The larderer, the servant in charge of overseeing the preservation of meats, examines each cut carefully. The salting method is one of the oldest and most reliable techniques for food preservation. Meat is liberally coated with coarse salt, drawing out moisture and inhibiting the growth of bacteria. The salted cuts are left to cure, sometimes for weeks, before being moved to a cooler storage space. In the larder, you will also find jars of pickled vegetables, prepared during harvest time, ensuring that even in winter, there will be a supply of fresh-tasting produce. The pantler, another key figure in the kitchen, manages the bread and grain stores. The pantry is filled with sacks of wheat, barley, and oats, as well as loaves of bread from the previous day. Bread is a staple of the medieval diet, and preserving it is essential. Older loaves are often repurposed in dishes like pottage or dried out to make breadcrumbs. During times of plenty, grain would be stored in bulk, but it had to be kept away from humidity, as mold could spoil entire sacks. Next to the larder is the buttery, where liquids, wine, ale, and mead, are kept. Wine is a major part of the noble diet, and wine cellars, or butts, in castles were often deep and cool, keeping the wine at a stable temperature to preserve its flavor. Just as with the bread, casks of wine and beer were closely monitored, and any spoiled batches were discarded to prevent contamination of the rest. As the day progresses, the kitchen becomes a hive of activity. The cook calls for the roasting of meats, the boiling of pottages, and the preparation of sauces. But, as he knows well, the day's meals are just part of his job. Preserving enough food to last through the long winter is a far more significant concern. Behind the scenes, the castle's workers are busy gathering wild game from the forest. The hunter will return with fresh venison, wild boar, and birds, which are immediately cleaned and salted for preservation. If there is any fresh meat left over, it will be smoked to prolong its shelf life. Smoking meat is another critical method used by the kitchen staff. A stone or wooden building, often situated far from the main living quarters to keep smoke from entering the hall, is set aside as the smokehouse. Hams, sausages, and even fish are hung in the smokehouse to dry out. The rising smoke not only imparts flavor, but also helps preserve the meat for months. Meat stored this way will be used in times when fresh meat is scarce or during the harsh months of winter. In the kitchen, fruit preservation is also important. Jars of honey and sugar line shelves, waiting to be filled with fruit from the summer harvest. Plums, pears, and apples are often stewed and preserved with honey, offering a sweet treat during the long winter months. The practice of preserving fruit in sugar or honey syrup helps prevent spoilage and adds a touch of luxury to the otherwise humble meals of the season. The ice house, though a luxury feature, is another brilliant invention of the medieval period. Built underground or partially covered with straw and earth, the ice house stores ice and snow collected during the winter months. This precious commodity allows the kitchen to store fresh food like dairy and meats, keeping them cool during the warmer months. The ice could last for weeks, even months, making it an essential tool for food preservation during the summer. Even though the kitchen is a bustling place during the day, much of the real work goes unnoticed. The careful storage of food, the salting, pickling, smoking, and fermenting are tasks that continue around the clock. As the evening meal nears and the kitchen staff prepares to serve the lords and their guests, the preparations of the past months will be reflected in the quality and variety of the meal. Through these efforts, the castle's inhabitants will be kept well-fed through the harshest winters and under siege. As autumn settled over the land, the castle kitchen transformed from a place of daily cooking to a hub of urgent preparation. This was the season of harvest and slaughter, the time when the success of the coming winter depended on how well food was preserved. The stakes were high. In a world without refrigeration, improperly stored food could mean famine. The cooks and stewards of the castle understood this better than anyone. The first sign of this seasonal shift was the arrival of livestock from the pastures. Pigs, cattle, and sheep were herded into the lower courtyard, not for grazing but for slaughter. Feeding large animals through winter required stores of grain and hay, which were too valuable to spare. Instead, most were butchered in autumn and preserved through salting and smoking. Salting was the most common and vital method of preservation. In a side building near the kitchen, large wooden tubs were filled with coarse salt imported at great expense, sometimes from as far away as France or the Mediterranean coast. The freshly butchered meat was cleaned and cut into manageable joints, then packed tightly into the tubs and completely covered in salt. Salt absorbed moisture and inhibited bacterial growth, crucial for preventing spoilage. The meat would stay in the salt for weeks, sometimes over a month, before being hung to dry or placed in barrels for longer-term storage. Not far from the salting room stood the smokehouse, a dark, soot-covered building where the air was thick with the scent of oak and applewood. Here, meat was hung from ceiling beams and gently smoked for days or even weeks. The smoke not only flavored the meat but also created a dry, protective crust that made it difficult for bacteria or pests to take hold. Hams, sausages, and sides of bacon were all smoked in this way, with the best pieces reserved for the lord's table. Fish required different care. In castles near rivers or the sea, large quantities of fish were caught and preserved. Freshwater fish like pike, carp, and eel were salted, smoked, or dried. On the coast, entire stocks of herring and cod were cleaned, gutted, and hung to dry in the open air or placed in salt barrels for later use. These stockfish could last for months and were especially important on fasting days when meat was forbidden. Salted and dried fish became so essential to the diet that some castles formed trade relationships with fishing towns to ensure regular supply. But not every preservation method relied on salt and smoke. Pickling was a widespread and effective method for vegetables and fruits. In the kitchen, large ceramic jars were filled with sliced onions, cucumbers, turnips, and cabbages. These were packed in layers of salt, covered in a vinegar brine made from fermented wine, and sealed with waxed cloth or wooden lids. The acidic environment of the brine prevented harmful bacteria from growing. Some pickled goods, such as sauerkraut, relied entirely on natural fermentation, where beneficial bacteria transformed sugars in the cabbage into lactic acid, an early form of probiotic preservation. Cheese and dairy also required care. Milk from the castle's cows and goats was quickly turned into butter or cheese to extend its shelf life. Butter was salted heavily and packed into glazed pots stored in the cool pantry. Soft cheeses were consumed fresh, but harder varieties were aged in the cellar, where cool, stable temperatures allowed them to mature over several months. These cheeses would become an important protein source during the winter when fresh milk was no longer available. Fruits, too, were preserved in a variety of ways. Apples and pears were dried in thin slices and strung in garlands to hang in the pantry. Plums, cherries, and berries were cooked down into thick preserves with honey or sugar and stored in sealed pots. These sweet spreads were not only a rare treat during the lean months, but also a way to deliver much-needed energy and calories in a compact form. And then there were the grains, the bedrock of the medieval diet. Wheat, rye, oats, and barley were harvested and stored in sacks in the castle's granary, a dry, raised building designed to protect its contents from damp, rats, and mold. Grain was checked often for pests and rotated to prevent spoilage. Bread was baked daily in the castle's ovens using flour from the granary, but if flour grew old, it could sour or rot. Thus, grain preservation was perhaps the most closely watched part of the castle's food system. As the final days of autumn passed and the first frost blanketed the land, the castle's kitchens and storerooms stood full. Barrels of salted pork and beef lined the walls. Hams dangled in the rafters of the smokehouse, their smoky aroma lingering in the air. Pickled vegetables filled earthenware crocks. Sacks of grain were stacked with precision, ready to be milled and baked. Clay jars of honeyed fruit sat in rows like treasures from the summer. It was not excess or luxury, it was survival. The cold months ahead would test every bit of planning and preservation the castle had done. If the weather turned harsh or conflict interrupted supply lines, what had been stored now would determine who remained healthy and who went hungry. For the stewards and cooks of the castle, this was their moment of triumph or failure. The success of preserving food in a medieval castle relied as much on architecture as it did on knowledge. Every part of the castle's design, from the location of its storage rooms to the thickness of its walls, played a role in keeping food fresh. The kitchens themselves were often placed in separate wings or buildings, sometimes connected to the main hall by a short passageway. This wasn't just for convenience or to keep smoke away from the noble chambers, it was also a fire safety measure. With open flames, boiling cauldrons, and dry stores of grain and herbs, kitchens were high-risk zones. One stray ember could set an entire castle ablaze. Near the kitchen, an entire network of service rooms existed, each one specialized for preserving and storing different types of food. Chief among these was the larder, designed to store raw meat, fish, and some dairy. Built with thick stone walls and small ventilation slits, the larder was kept as cool and dark as possible. It was often placed on the castle's north side or partly underground to stay shielded from the sun. Inside, salted cuts of beef, mutton, and pork hung from wooden beams. Shelves supported jars of brined fish and pots of salted butter. The air was cold and still, and rodents were kept out by tightly fitted doors and raised thresholds. Next came the pantry, run by the pantler, who oversaw the bread, flour, dried goods, and often the cheese. The pantry was less cool than the larder but still built to limit temperature swings. A heavy stone slab ran along one wall, used to store fresh loaves and cheeses. Bread was baked daily in the ovens, but it wasn't wasted when it went stale. Yesterday's bread could be turned into trenchers, edible plates, or into ingredients for stews and puddings. The pantler also kept records of the flour reserves and the rate at which grain was consumed. Any sign of mold or insect activity meant urgent action. The buttery, managed by the butler, stored casks of ale, wine, and other drinks. Despite its name, it had nothing to do with butter. Instead, it took its name from the barrels or butts that lined its shelves. These great wooden casks were stacked in cool, shaded rooms, often dug partly into the ground to keep the temperature stable. The butler ensured that drink flowed steadily for the entire household, which could include dozens of knights, soldiers, servants, and guests. While wine and ale didn't spoil as quickly as food, improper storage could cause them to sour or go flat. Cleanliness, darkness, and well-sealed barrels were critical. One of the most ingenious structures for food preservation was the underground cellar. These vaulted chambers, carved into bedrock or built beneath the castle foundations, maintained a near-constant cool temperature year-round. The cellar stored perishable foods that weren't heavily salted, such as apples, root vegetables, large wheels of cheese, and even jars of preserved fruits. Some castles also used ice pits, where blocks of ice gathered during winter were packed in straw and buried underground. In wealthier castles, the ice could last well into summer, used to chill wine or extend the life of milk and butter during the warmer months. Another crucial asset was the granary, located in a high, dry area of the castle or nearby buildings. It stored the harvest of barley, oats, wheat, and rye, essential grains that formed the base of bread, porridge, and ale. To keep grain safe from pests, granaries were often raised off the ground on stone piers or wooden stilts. Sometimes, the legs were capped with smooth discs called rat stones that rats couldn't climb over. Inside, grain was regularly turned and inspected. A single infestation could ruin an entire winter's supply. Outside the main kitchens, fish ponds, rabbit warrens, and dovecots supplemented preserve stores with live food. These were clever biological solutions to the problem of food freshness. A castle with a spring-fed pond could raise fish like carp and pike, ensuring fresh protein even in winter or during fasting days when meat was forbidden. Dovecots provided a constant source of squab, young pigeon, which matured quickly and could be harvested as needed. Rabbits bred rapidly and were housed in enclosed areas called warrens, carefully guarded against predators. Throughout this infrastructure, labor and discipline were essential. Servants rotated barrels, stirred brines, turned cheeses, and swept storerooms. They watched for signs of spoilage, mold on grain, pest and flour sacks, sour smells from barrels. Their vigilance meant the difference between security and starvation. And their reward was subtle, not fame or glory, but the knowledge that they had helped the castle endure, unseen guardians of the castle's stomach. Castles were often viewed as military strongholds, but within their walls existed a second line of defense, a system of preservation so advanced and calculated that it could sustain dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people for months without resupply. These quiet, cold chambers were as vital as the armory or the walls, ensuring the lord, the soldiers, and every soul within could withstand siege, storm, or harshest winter. Winter brought challenges to any household, but for a castle, especially one under siege, it was a test of every preservation skill the kitchen had ever practiced. The comfort of full stores could evaporate quickly when supply lines were cut and fields were abandoned. In such moments, food preservation wasn't a matter of convenience, it was the key to survival. When the first warning of a siege came, distant columns of soldiers, smoke on the horizon, or a scout's report of approaching armies, the castle responded swiftly. Gates were shut, bridges pulled, and the kitchen became a command post for rationing. The steward met with the cook and the head servants to count every barrel, bag, and sack. No more fresh goods would come in. Everything the castle had preserved had to now last through the unknown length of isolation. Inside the granary, servants tallied sacks of barley, oats, and rye. Grain became the base for every meal, boiled into pottage, baked into dark loaves, or brewed into weak ale to replace unsafe water. The supply had to be carefully guarded, not just from spoilage, but from desperate hands. Even theft from within the castle became a threat in times of hunger. In the buttery, the butler sealed off the casks of ale and wine, establishing a daily limit for the garrison. Clean drinking water was often a challenge during winter and sieges alike, so ale, especially small ale, with low alcohol, was essential. It was safe to drink and provided energy. Still, it had to be conserved. Ale kept well in properly sealed barrels, but if exposed to air or temperature fluctuations, it could spoil. The butler's daily task was to sample it, maintain it, and guard it. Meanwhile, the larder gave up its bounty in slow, measured portions. Salted meats, smoked fish, and dried sausages were carefully rotated and checked. Each day, the cook pulled just enough to feed the essential personnel, knights, guards, senior staff, while everyone else made do with smaller shares. The salted meat was soaked in water overnight to reduce its salinity before cooking. Smoked meat, especially bacon or sausage, was often chopped into stews to add richness to otherwise plain dishes of beans or grains. Vegetables, long since pickled in the fall, became vital. Earthen jars of pickled cabbage, onions, and turnips were opened one by one. The sharp vinegar flavors were a blessing, breaking the monotony of preserved meat and offering a boost to digestion. These pickled vegetables could keep for many months if stored properly and were a reliable source of vitamins at a time when scurvy and weakness could creep in. The cellar, kept cool and dark, still held root vegetables. Carrots, parsnips, and leeks had been packed in sand or straw and stored away from frost. Though shriveled and less flavorful than in their harvest prime, they were still usable. Each one added bulk and substance to the daily stew. Potatoes had not yet arrived in Europe, that would come centuries later, so every root mattered. From the ice house, carefully rationed snow blocks helped cool butter or preserve the last of the milk turned into cheese. The castle's hard cheeses, aged from the summer, were cut slowly, slice by slice. With their thick rinds and dense interiors, some cheeses could last many months if untouched by damp or mold. When fresh food was gone, the dovecot and fish pond became precious. Pigeons provided occasional meat. Squab, when still young, was tender and nourishing. The pond, if not frozen over, offered a rare chance at a fresh meal. Fish pulled from the icy waters were roasted or boiled, then shared carefully. On church-designated fasting days, which forbade meat, these fish became the only permitted option for protein. Still, the people within the castle grew leaner. Bellies grumbled. Children cried at night from hunger. Meals shrank to one per day. A bowl of thin gruel, a heel of bread, a sliver of cheese, each became valuable. The castle's leadership turned to strict rationing, with meticulous records and daily adjustments. The cook, once a provider of comfort and variety, became an enforcer of austerity. Yet amidst hardship, the wisdom of prior seasons proved itself. Every pickled turnip, every barrel of salted beef, every jar of preserved plum was a testament to preparation. It was not just the stones of the castle that held back the siege, it was the jars, barrels, and brines in the kitchen below. Day after day, the kitchen held. And as long as the smoke rose from the hearth and bowls were filled, however humbly, the castle stood unbroken. The siege had ended. The snow had begun to melt, and the fields outside the castle walls once again showed signs of life. Smoke no longer rose from distant enemy camps, and silence had returned to the countryside. Inside the castle, the mood shifted from survival to celebration. Lean faces brightened. The ration books were put away. It was time, at last, to open the final stores and welcome the return of abundance. In the great hall, preparations began for a victory feast. The larder, once cautiously guarded, was now proudly opened. A few smoked hams, carefully preserved since the last autumn, were hung above the fire to warm. The final crocks of pickled vegetables were uncorked, their aroma sharp and lively. Wheels of aged cheese, cracked open after months in the cellar, released their earthy scent. The last stores were not only food, they were memory of past summers, of labor and foresight, of the quiet war fought in the kitchens. The head cook directed his team with renewed energy. The roasting spit was filled once more. Trenchers of fresh bread, the first baked with newly ground grain from the returning millers, were piled high. Spring herbs from the newly green courtyards were chopped and stirred into sauces. Even dried fruits, steeped in honey and spice, returned to the table, reminders of the sweetness that had once seemed so distant. The noble family descended from their private chambers to join the household. The Lord gave thanks to the castle's people, not just the guards who manned the walls, but the unseen hands who ensured no one starved, the larder keepers, the picklers, the butlers, the bakers. They had not only preserved food, they had preserved the future. But even as the feast was laid out, new tasks had already begun. The first planting of spring was underway. In the herb gardens and kitchen plots, seedlings were being nurtured. Chickens were returning to their coops. Fish ponds were being cleaned. Salt stores were checked. The cycle began again. The knowledge of preservation, passed down through generations, was as important to the castle as any weapon. These weren't improvisations, they were time-honored systems based on centuries of adaptation. Castles in England, France, Germany, and beyond all shared common techniques but also regional flair. In colder climates, more emphasis was placed on salting and drying. In warmer regions, olive oil and vinegar were more abundant, offering different kinds of brines and pickling methods. Each locale shaped its preservation culture, and every castle became a repository of culinary resilience. Preservation was more than just preparing for scarcity, it was a philosophy of foresight. It meant planning during times of plenty for the inevitability of hardship. It meant recognizing that food, once harvested, was not safe until it was secured, dried, smoked, salted, buried, hung, or sealed. And it meant that every worker in the kitchen, from the scullion scrubbing floors to the steward calculating rations, was part of something greater than daily meals. They were guardians of the castle's lifeline. The methods used, salting, smoking, drying, pickling, fermenting, aging, burying, and chilling, were not temporary solutions. They were foundational practices that supported life for centuries before modern refrigeration. They transformed vulnerable harvests into durable stores. They made it possible for castles to remain self-sufficient for months, or even years, in isolation. As twilight fell over the stone walls and torches flickered in the hall, the castle once again felt like a home. The people feasted, not just in victory, but in gratitude for the land, for the labor, and for the quiet, enduring intelligence of the kitchen. And so, the story of how castle kitchens kept food fresh is not merely one of culinary technique. It is the story of human adaptability, of survival through knowledge, and of the deep-rooted connection between food and the fate of kingdoms. That's the story of how castle kitchens kept food fresh, through smoke, Salt, ice, and centuries of survival. Which part did you find the most surprising? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed the journey, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us next time for more stories from the past.